Criterion Standards, that's a term you will have heard. Criteria refers to those parts or sections or elements of the task that you actually want the students to produce. The standards refers to the level of quality of each criterion at which they actually produce that task.
Here's an example of a set of criterion standards, sometimes referred to as a rubric. On the left-hand side, you can see the criteria or task elements the student needs to demonstrate. Along the top are the standards which help define the different levels of quality at which the student can demonstrate these criteria.
Assessment is really important to students. Their grades are really important to them. One of the things that may sometimes remain a mystery to them is how they got the grades that they did for particular assessment tasks that they do. That's where criteria and standards are so important in your range of support materials that you give your students. The language of criteria and standards makes obvious to students what it is you value in the task and interprets that for them. So criteria and standards not only need to be familiar to you, they need to be familiar to the student as well, and the student needs to be given opportunities to use those criteria and standards to be able to assess their own work. In order to be able to do that though, they need to know the language of the criteria and standards, and they need to be able to see how they're used. So writing the criteria and standards is very important because you need to do that task of interpreting what's quality and the different standards of quality against what's really essential in the task and say, this is what I'm looking for, but this is what it looks like. So the language of the criteria and standards is very important.
Here's an example of a set of criterion standards, sometimes referred to as a rubric. On the left-hand side, you can see the criteria or task elements the student needs to demonstrate. Along the top are the standards which help define the different levels of quality at which the student can demonstrate these criteria.
Now we've prepared marking rubrics that break the assessment task as a whole assessment piece down into individual tasks which are quite specific and measurable. The marking rubrics then provide indicators of what we're looking for at various levels of achievement for each of those tasks. So what might be a sound, good or excellent response or submission for a student on a particular task. And when we write these marking rubrics, we're very concise and clear with what we're after and try to avoid ambiguity at all times. So one example might be, of an ambiguous marking rubric might say something like, under a task of demonstrating problem solving, that the student has a high level of reflection on how to improve their problem solving capabilities. Well, what is high level reflection? As academics we could debate that, and certainly the students will probably have another opinion of what that is. So rather than using these vague terms, we say things like, you will produce a reflective journal entry that will conclude with an action plan on how specifically you wish to address or how specifically you wish to improve your problem solving skills. And in my view, that's a high level reflection where you've identified something that needs to improve, you've thought about it and come up with a plan for action to make that improvement.
I've also included, and it might seem as a simple thing, but I've included copies of the actual marking sheets for the students before they do any assignments. And the reason why I've done that is to be transparent with the students, to show when exactly they're being assessed and how much each of these areas of that assessment task are worth. Something that I've learned from students that have done other units is that they've found that sometimes they can get a bit of a shock when they get their assignments back and it's a lot lower than they thought it would be, just simply because there was a miscommunication somewhere. I decided, no, I'll do it straight at the beginning of the term. This is what you're being assessed on, and this is what each these sections is worth. And the feedback of that has been very interesting. Students have, even though it's a simple thing, the students have actually been very appreciative of actually doing that.
We'd also like to think that our students, as they move their way through their degree, become more independent in the way that they're able to look at their own work and improve it. Students said pretty strongly to us that they use a well-written Criterion Standards rubric as a self-assessment tool. That for many of them, this was the thing that they went back to time after time in the period leading up to completing their assessment and submitting it. So one of their key messages is that we need to be led into an understanding of what the Criterion Standards mean. They need to be transparent enough to us so that we can use them ourselves.
From the instructor's perspective, it's not that overnight you can make the rubric. A lot of hard work has to, I think, go in, reflection from instructor's point in this for case study development rubric, to think very carefully how we are going to assess the task. Because if the rubric is not correct, then the assessment will not be correct. So as an instructor, I also have to put in enough effort to understand what I am expecting out of them, so there is no ambiguity, and students also, when they see, it should be very clear to them what is expected from them. So they know beforehand what they have to, how much hard work they have to put in to do the assignment task and submit that task.
One thing to consider when you're writing your Criterion Standards is that the difference between the different standards for each criterion must be expressed in such a way that it really shows students what you are expecting them to do. So the difference between very good, good, average, poor doesn't really provide students with insight into what it is you think the difference is between those different standards, and won't really allow them to be able to self-assess because they won't have an understanding of that.
So in developing criteria sheets or rubrics that students understand, it's very important that the language of each level, so a high distinction down to a pass or fail, it clearly articulates what differentiates, say for example, a high distinction to a distinction. So it's using particular qualitative and quantitative language to make it clear to students what it is that they need to do to get a high distinction or a distinction or pass or credit. Additionally, the criteria sheets needs to be explored with the students. So it's a kind of unpacking of the criteria sheets so that students can see in detail what it is that they need to do.
Here is an example of a set of Criterion Standards, sometimes referred to as a rubric. On the left-hand side, you can see the criteria or task elements the student needs to demonstrate. Along the top are the standards, which help define the different levels of quality at which the student can demonstrate these criteria.
Finally, when creating your own Criterion Standards for your tasks, make sure Criterion Standards are in clear, unambiguous language. When writing a rubric, make sure you identify clear qualitative or quantitative differences between levels of performance instead of using vague descriptors like poor, satisfactory, good, and excellent. Encourage students to self and peer assess using these criteria and standards within your tutorials.
We hope you've enjoyed this short video outlining the essential nature of Criterion Standards in assessment support. We'll leave you with some reflection questions that can guide your practice as you consider this element in design of your unit. How do students currently know how grades are allocated for your assessment tasks? Does your current rubric make clear distinctions between the varying levels of achievement? Do you currently have a short video or tutorial session dedicated to explaining the criteria and standards?